So, good afternoon, everyone. And I'd like to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to joining this educational seminar to build your knowledge, add value to your life in ways that maybe you're not aware of as yet, but you will be after this presentation. So, before we begin, let us pray. Dear loving Lord, I thank you for granting us the richest blessing of life to be here in this moment. I want to thank you for everything that you have done for us in the past, everything you're doing for us in the present, everything that you are going to do in the future. Be with the presenter as she presents, and may we learn beneficial knowledge from her presentation. Thank you all for all the participants who joined. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay. So for everyone who saw the flyer, as you can tell, this seminar will be about pretty much Black History Month in a nutshell. So we all know that it is now February, and we will be tracing the diaspora, the African diaspora, throughout the Black History Month, specifically Jamaica. We'll be focusing on Jamaica with our presenter, Dr. Hardware, or Dr. Shawnee Hardware, in case you're wondering how her name is pronounced. Or, yeah, because, all right. So, without further ado, I will now grant her the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. I must say that I attempted to look primarily at initially at the Caribbean, but I wanted to give justice to the different ethno-racial groups, and I found that a presentation of this nature wouldn't have done that. So I decided to focus on Jamaica, but I'm happy to hear thoughts about other events and practices in the wider Caribbean, especially the Anglo-Caribbean. Just in terms of the agenda, I will have my introduction, a little icebreaker, then focusing on the main content and a wrap up. I know people time is valuable, so we'll have a conversational presentation, and I hope for input as we go through the various slides. So I am a daughter of Jamaica. I did my undergraduate in history. I almost did an undergraduate in med tech at NCU, but I decided to do undergraduate in history because it was my first love. And thereafter, I decided to look at language in educational spaces. And so my master's and my PhD focus on language development and learning, curriculum development, etc. So I am a sociolinguist. For my PhD and my master's, I looked at multiliteracies, which gives value to the different types of literacy and moves the center away from just print-based literacies. And we know, given our history, that we have a rich oral culture, which is not sometimes developed or capitalized on. As a matter of fact, for my PhD, I looked at how to use patois as a learning tool in schools, and I did my research at an inner city school in Jamaica. I need to do more, have more conversations around that. But in more recent years, I've been focusing on anti-racism education and student engagement. So the bulk of my work, especially during COVID and thereafter, focuses on anti-racism and student engagement, looking specifically at youth engagement. I'm currently a professor at George Brown College, and I do consulting work here as well. Okay. Before I get into my presentation, I wanted to do a check-in. So I don't know if you have access to scanning the QR code, which is presented on screen. I'll give about a minute or so for people to scan it, and then I will transfer over to the page so that I can see the answers. So just a minute if you're not using your phone to view this presentation. I'll give a minute for you to scan the code. I'll also have the website up once I transfer over, so it should not be a problem for you to access it.
Yes, Dr. Hardware. I was able to access the site from the code. So I'm just waiting for you to change slides now.
Okay, so I'll wait another 30 seconds, and then if there are other people there who need some time to do that, then I'll transfer over in 15 seconds.
Okay, guys, please don't feel shy to let us know when you're on the site through the chat. That would be appreciated. That is, if you're in a position to scan. Thank you.
Okay, that's my timer. So I'll just transfer over. It's just a little getting to know you so that I can have an understanding of who are the people I'm having a conversation with. So the first one is a typical check-in that I do in terms of on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 4, based on the faces here. How are we feeling today? The green is, and I'm just realizing that these look very much like political colors, which is not intentional. The green is you are super happy. Things are going well. The orange is things could be better. So I'll give another 10 seconds. How are we feeling? I see 2 people. We're between yellow and orangish, whatever that in between color is. And then the next question is, where in the Caribbean are you from? I initially had Jamaica, but I didn't want to assume that everyone here would have been Jamaican, so I wanted to make it more inclusive. So where in the Caribbean are you from? I see 2 Jamaicans are represented. For people who are just joining, you can go to menti.com and use this code to join. So I'll give another 10 seconds and then I'll change over. Okay. And then the last question is, what is your area of specialization? So I was talking to Michael earlier, and he told me he was in film, and I said, luckily, I'm doing a general sweep of the media landscape rather than looking specifically at any one particular medium. But what is your area of specialization? And you should be able to type this one. Okay, I see journalism. I'm going to allow for 30 seconds for the answer. Another 20 seconds, and then, okay, I see two journalism. Another 10 seconds is public relations. Okay, so we have journalism and public relations. Okay, for people who are just joining, I am a sociolinguist, so most of my content, and given my history background, most of my content will focus on that, but the presentation is meant to be dialogical, so please share your thoughts, etc., using the chat, or if you can unmute, then there's an option to do that. I want to start out. I want to start out by framing the content, saying historically the media has been used to expedite empire management and control, especially during the war years. So this is a quote from Gordon Bell, who paints a picture of how the media in the Caribbean at large, especially during the war years and up until I would say around the 1980s, have been used as a colonial tool to reinforce rules and British propaganda. And in some cases, it has been used to subjugate, especially Black working class people. Uh, in terms of definition, I equate Jamaican traditional cultural representation as Black culture, but there are others who may differ. So this is how I equated it in my PhD and my subsequent work. What are your thoughts on this notion of, or this form of this idea? Is Jamaican traditional cultural representation correctly equated to be Black culture? What are your thoughts? You're waiting for some conversation in the chat, or on muting if that's an option.
Okay, so I was taking some time to try and understand the question or the statement. So based on my understanding, you're saying it states that, well, Black culture is often associated with Jamaica in general, speaking from an
Jamaican
international
traditional
basis.
cultural representation. So, in essence, when we think of Jamaican traditional cultural representation, what immediately comes to mind and what is typically painted in the media is looking at Afro-Caribbean or Afro-Jamaican culture. So often left out in this framing are the different ethno-racial or ethnocultural groups that exists in Jamaica. So I wanted to hear people's thoughts on this. Do we agree? Do we disagree? Are we neutral about the topic?
I agree that it represents Black culture, what we see, well, the Jamaican culture in the media.
Oh, thank you for that. We'll take some other responses.
I also agree with that statement because a lot of times when we think about Jamaican culture, we only think about the Afro Caribbean culture, as you had said, because we don't really look on the other ethnicities that make up Jamaican culture. Because as you know, the most of us have many one people, it's not only African and Caribbean people. You also have Indian people, you have Chinese, you have a lot of different ethnicities that make up our culture. We see that in our food, we see that in our dance, everything, our music, everything. So I agree with this statement. It's not really represented as much in the media, and I think they can do it to represent that part of it.
Okay, thank you for that, KCN. Any other responses? Okay, I think people still need some time to think, etc. So we'll keep it moving. I do have more questions embedded in the presentation. As I said, it's meant to be dialogical, so we do hope for some conversation. So similar to what, and I know you're a professor as Tara, so if I do say so, um, I'm referring to your professor, Tara, and Casey had mentioned. The literature has shown us that there is, and I guess based on your own studies, you'll recognize that there's a lack of adequate intersectional representation in the Jamaican and by extension, the Caribbean traditional media. And by this, I think uh, KCN adequately explained that where different groups are not adequately represented in many forms and also in nuanced ways in the media. We know that in more recent years, and I have a question about that, so I won't go into much details, we are seeing more large-scale representation, especially outside of quote unquote traditional media, looking at more social media, etc. And those content emerging from Jamaica, but by and large, there needs to be more representation there. But beyond this, there's also and traditionally, historically, while we now while there's a equating of Jamaican culture with Black culture, what we see is a disregard, especially up until 2010, I'll say, for what is typically seen as West African influence funds of knowledge. And we're looking at patois, folklore, especially when we think of the news and more formalize programming. And there's now a concerted effort for more traditional representation of Jamaican culture in the media. My next question is, can you think of the first time you watched a program where you saw a nuanced representation of Jamaican or Caribbean culture in the media? So think back at the answers that were given before from Professor and Kasian in terms of that nuance, in terms of the ways in which we're to represent our motto, etc. When was the first time that you watched a program and saw this nuanced representation? And what was that program? That is the second part of the question that's not written there. What is the program? And when was the first time you saw that nuanced representation? I'll give you some time.
So while they're thinking, I'm going to probably expose myself a little bit because most
Don't
of them
expose
might
your
not
age now.
remember.
Are we talking about age or
Most
what?
of them might not know or remember, but the first time I can remember seeing it was in the 80s.
Mm-mm.
And I'm sure that most of them were not even thought of, much less to be born.
Yeah.
And it was Lime Tree Lane.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know who remembers that in the chat. Please give me some support.
It might be only the both of us in terms of Lime Tree Lane, but I'm sure they might know of some other one. So let's think about nuance representation of Jamaican culture. So we're thinking about shows that would have given you a breadth of Jamaican culture representation, shows that you would have thought, oh, this is a good representation of my own lived experiences, my own life, what I see in everyday Jamaican experience. If there's none, then we can say I've not seen any, and we keep it moving. So nuance representation of Jamaican culture.
Guys, even on digital media, since most of you don't do traditional television, but digital social media, are there any that you would have seen that represents your culture?
Or maybe when we're talking about culture, it could also be small c culture, where it doesn't necessarily have to be looking at the broader Jamaican culture, but your own subcultural groups, right? That you think, oh, this is Royal Palm Estate. I was thinking more Royal Palm Estate, York Douglas. While I do remember Lime Tree Lane, not dating myself, I think for me, Royal Palm Estate would be more prominent in my mind. Okay. Are there any other while we
This would count, sorry. I don't know if this would count, but
mm-hmm.
well, there is a play called
Mm-hmm.
Kitchen Patchy. I've
Oh
never
yes.
been to it. Yes, it's very, it brings out the culture of Jamaica, a lot of things. And
Mm-hmm.
also there are some influence on TikTok and Instagram. So we
Mm-hmm.
have Julian, we also have Basilia, so we have Every Royal. Those are people that are always been met these as kids, and you really see Jamaican culture being brought out in their skits and their little videos. So I guess that would count.
Yes, yes, yes. And especially looking at, as I mentioned, social media, um, or maybe I intimated looking at social media, you'll see that. Thank you for that, Casey. And York Douglas is saying the recent Bob Marley One Love movie. I did not watch that one, but I saw the clips. So I'm yet to see how that nuance is represented there, York Douglas. Okay. So in terms of an overview, then we saw where in the media in general, there has been expansion of Black consciousness. So we start with and recall the conversation, the initial slides about the world wars, how media was used as a form of control. So we're looking at the 1920s and 30s with Garvism and how that played a big role in terms of the expansion of Black consciousness, the spilling over in terms of predominantly newspapers. And then in the 1960s and 70s, we have Pan-Africanism, which is associated with with Garvism and the Black Panther movement, etc., looking at the notion that we're all Africans, and there's this connection to the motherland, putting it simply. And then some will argue that we are in a post-colonial period, even though scholars might say we're not post-colonial, we have simply exchanged one particular master for another. And so we still see the heavy influence of particularly American media or American style programming on our in our media services that we get. Well, when we think about cable TV, and then but initially satellite TV and then cable TV, and how that also influenced the way in which our programs roll out, or even social media content. So World War II saw the growth of Caribbean media consciousness, where we saw more, especially with the agitation for independence, etc. We saw a proliferation of newspaper that was focused on promoting this notion of Black consciousness, what it means to be Black, cutting away from empire, which is the British, and agitation towards independence. But with this, particularly in the 1960s, as we got our independence, there was a concerted effort to censor this political consciousness and literature and content, right? So right on the heels of independence, we saw where empire, the monarchy was using through its various governors, etc., and this is throughout the Anglo-Caribbean as well, to trample on this notion and agitation for independence. With this, we saw the rise of numerous radical newspapers, as they're categorized in the literature. So we have the Ben in Jamaica, which was quite short-lived, and we had Moko elsewhere. And what these newspapers did was they curated critical consciousness, in the sense that they took the agitation of the day and spoke about, what grassroots Jamaicans were thinking, which were typically Black, working class, working poor Jamaicans. There were also the organizers or the influencers of social groups, and acts as a counterculture to the influx of foreign content that dominated the media as a result of the proliferation of domestic satellites in the US. So recall a couple of years ago, we had those big, and I'm dating myself here, but I recall those extra large satellite dishes which get content from the US, and those popularity before cable. And so these newspapers acted as a counter to this form of proliferation of foreign-dominated content coming primarily from the United States. Moore explained, this is Carla Moore, who is, I recall, a student of UA and a journalism student when we met at the time. I think she branched off in different areas now. But recently denoted that despite of this consistent effort to push Black consciousness, there is a persistent anti-Black racism in Jamaica that is often silenced, even in the media. And there appears to be a limited impetus to address the social inequality with race-based policies because of the notion that we live in a hybrid, we have a hybrid demographic that renders Blackness insignificant. So I recall having conversation with one of my colleague who is from Guyana, and I was talking about wanting to come back to Jamaica to work after I finished my PhD. And she said, "Oh, I'm doing it." She's was born in Jamaica. She was born in Guyana, in Canada, went to Guyana, and she's Indian. And we started having a conversation about, what that looks like, because she with at the time her Canadian citizens and different form of accents, etc., was planning to come, and I was having that conversation, and she took offense to it when I started talking about anti-Blackness and how foreigners are seen and rendered in some cases more important for the job market than people who are of Jamaican background. So Kelly predates Monroe, but Kelly noted that the nation is not read as being racially, as having a racial hierarchy, but in some cases, it's seen as we're adhering to our motto in terms of everyone belonging, etc. But we know that, especially from these experiences, or maybe from our personal experiences, that there's always this this divide or invincible line that we see even as we watch media, for those who still consume the media. I listen to, and I'm a fan of Cliff Hughes, so I listen to Cliff Hughes every day, and I still hear the struggles of Jamaicans, and they talk about this type of silencing, or this notion of the struggles that typical working class people face, and we see how that's also represented on who becomes up until I guess maybe 5 years ago, who are the key persons reading the news, and what's their particular skin color in terms of that dominance. Monique Kelly in 2024 noted or added to more again by saying that inequality is principally held to be class-based, regulating colorism to a public secret, something that everybody knows exists, but for one reason or another cannot easily acknowledge it. And with that, we see where radio has been one of those a form of media that kind of levels the playing field in terms of access to Jamaican talent and promoting Jamaican talent, but also giving typically underserved voices, particularly in newspaper and television, a space to develop their talents. And we'll talk about social media, or you'll talk about social media later. So traditionally, shows such as with the advent of Jamaican Broadcasting Company, shows such as Talent Parade helped to launch the careers of very important Jamaican talents, such as the Right Honorable Louise Bennett Coverley. It was radio programs like these that really put Jamaican talents in the spotlight, Black Jamaican talents in the spotlight. However, when folks or folk tales are presented in cultural programs, and this is coming from Fall 2015, and from my own research, I recognize that this continues to be the same. Typically, when there's a use of Jamaican cultural expression, especially patois, these are left for more conversational speech rather than seen as in formal setting. So Paul noted that folk tales are presented in such cultural programs. The announcing and storytelling are strictly in Jamaican Standard English, while Jamaican Creole, or Jamaican, as a Caribbean sociolinguists would prefer to use, features are restricted to the direct speech of character. So you see that there is come to play the politics of language in terms of what gets to be seen as formal or informal, even as these programs were popular. Continuing with the role of radio, let me just check to see if I'm doing well for time. There has been a heavy criticism and sidelining of shows up until around a decade ago. around shows that use very heavy patois content. So Dread at the Controls and others, for various reasons, were heavily criticized. Up until last year, I heard this caller was mentioning in a program on Nationwide. I predominantly sit in Nationwide, so most of my references will be from there. How the use of the vernacular makes the presenter sound vulgar. And that was debunked, but we still have those conversations. And then IREFM, in its inception, made tremendous contribution to the reggae, with its reggae format, to the local culture, giving spaces for local talents again. And so up until a decade ago, Jamaican content in Creole was mainly restricted to talk shows and radio DJs. So we see radio rather than television playing that role. And I wanted to ask you, since I left Jamaica a decade ago, what are your own observations from your studies or from your lived experiences, or maybe what people have been talking about, anecdotal evidence? What are your observations of what's happening in terms of language and cultural portrayal in Jamaican media? So what's your observation for the past decade in the Jamaican media? Do we still have this form of politics of language and hierarchy, or would you say that things are pretty much equal out, or equal?
Okay, so while everyone else is thinking, I'll just do my input. So, on the Jamaican radio specifically, I think it's a bit whitewashed. Even radio stations like Fire 105 are now very popular, and it's seen as the go-to when playing for when an audience of people is listening, or a mixed group. And that's not, there is no reggae on Fire 105 and the popular
Oh.
radio channels. So it's mostly songs from America, mainstream music, with that doesn't speak about Jamaican culture. And in terms of language, I'm not sure if this is a valuable addition, but
It will be.
standard English is it depends on the group that you're around. When you're out on the street and they hear you speaking standard English like how I'm speaking now, it's somewhat frowned upon. They say you was soft. They think you're an easy victim. It- so basically, if you speak standard English, it's victim mentality. You have to chat brawling.
Oh.
Well, as my grandfather would say, you have to chat pot water, not power, in order to be seen as like your typical tough Jamaican male. And I think it kind of shows in the media as well, because even Jamaican programs, there's not much power, just standard English. But it does reach a wider audience, so I understand from that perspective.
Oh, thank you for that. And I do agree. So when I come to Jamaica, I try to, especially when I'm on the streets, I try to speak patois, and then my friends are like, "Oh, you're getting an accent." So even here, I have to try to speak patois to ensure that I sound authentic once I'm there on the street. So thank you for that. Anyone else? What are your
Just wanted to
observations?
my observation, I think there has been a shift somewhat. When you listen to radio stations, like recently I've been listening to, I think it's Edge FM, where you see them using more of the Jamaican dialect in it, and persons participating. So I think there has been a shift with the introduction of the different stations. I think the IRE FM, that and also based on the crowd, that they have a particular target audience, and you have to speak to them in the language that they all are socialized in. So I've seen a shift overall. The more traditional radio stations, no, but you see some persons trying to introduce a little of it, but you have those radio stations that fully cater to the to our language, or language of socialization.
And I see Douglas is agreeing with you that our station has become more liberal with the use of patois. So we see radio station and social media leading the fort. My take on the matter when I was doing my PhD was that it was actually the popularity of Jamaican patois in many international movies, such as Meet Joe Black, where Brad Pitt spoke patois, which made more middle and upper class people more comfortable with code switching between English and patois in public settings, such as the radio, or not the radio, but TV, etc. So you see where with the internationalization of patois and Jamaican culture, that played a bigger role in terms of middle and upper class Jamaican acceptance of the language in public spaces, particularly on television. There might be others who disagree, but the more popular it became international and more accepted than we see that being used and accepted amongst the middle class, hence more in media. All right, York, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Doctor, and I appreciate this program that you have presented here. I've also realized if we go back to the era of our football, it wasn't until the Reggae Boys made it on the world, so to speak, that we had a greater appreciation for football, and it showed some sense of unity for us as a people. And as you mentioned, we hear a lot of patois across the North America, like more than ever before. Or our family members who have gone away, they embrace it more, I think, than us to an extent. But that has been changing over the years. As you said, we've become more appreciative of it. It's not just the little man down at Coronation Market, but even within the universities, there's a greater appreciation for speaking patois. What I found interesting, or what I see interesting, is our children who are coming up, 4, 5, 6, Doc. When you speak to them, you get a different spin because they are speaking English. They're speaking the North American language. And this, I think, is as a result of their being hooked on their devices. So they spend a lot of time watching, and you're having a normal conversation, and they're giving you North American language. So I find that very interesting.
Yes.
But as far as I see it, our culture have really embraced the patois here and overseas, and the radio stations have been doing more patois vocalizations. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that, York. Is this a Kate? I'm a sociolinguist, but I'm not good at applied linguistics. So
that is Shakon. So the name is Shakon.
Okay. Shakon.
All right. So I want to agree with York.
Yeah.
In terms of what is happening with our kids today, because I had a kind of a personal exposure to a situation where a nephew of mine, he really speaks in standard English. But I realized also that he has an accent. And again, this was attributed to the fact that he, for the most part, would have been on his tablet. And so the characters that he would have been seeing over and over, he tends to speak like those characters. And so you're getting the standard, you're getting the standard English, also with some form of an accent with it as well. And so it now leads him to wonder, what will happen in terms of that patois that we're speaking of now. We might end up losing this with the advent of time.
That is for consideration, especially we think about how children learn language and they use statistical rule and patterning. So using that as a way of to mimic. So we also know of young children and the popular Pepper Pig and how that also influenced the language that they use. But that's an interesting conversation around accents and how that is transferred in younger children. Tara, you had your hand up?
Yes, quickly. I just wanted to add, I know that it's a little bit more on the linguistic side, but I realized that the on the continuum, most of the acceptable, well, the mesolect is what is mostly
Yeah.
acceptable. So you realize that though they speak patois, right, the baselect is not necessarily the one that is showcased when you have to when they speak, even within the media, right?
This
So
is true.
again, there's still some amount of bias that exists within using our language in the media.
Yeah, especially when we think about quote unquote traditional media, not looking primarily at social, but even in terms of social media, the program, and maybe due to age, that I see typically use the Mesolect rather than the Baselect is people who tend to do or might have access to time and money for programming might be those who also have some amount of education. I'm talking in general, not specific. And also in terms of what I consume or my partner consume, and I watch the car shows, etc., are typically using Mesolec, which is the in-between language. But in the interest of time, we'll continue. I did have some questions for discussion, but these could be more reflective around thinking about your own sector or your own program that you plan to go into. What changes can be implemented to ensure broader representation in your sector? And we're talking about intersectional representation now, not only of Black culture, but or Black Jamaican culture. And what are some of the challenges, if any, that we think we need to overcome to get this done? And so in summary, we recognize that there's an evolution in the representation of Black culture in Jamaican media. However, there's persistent and sometimes unacknowledged racism. There needs to be more work done in the media to ensure nuanced representation of Black culture, but also other ethno-racial groups, and the need for more post-colonial Jamaican content outside of social media in traditional media. I do have a time for Q&A, but I know that we were scheduled for an hour, so I want to respect your time, etc. York wants to know if racism is for real. What's your thoughts on the matter, York?
No, I was just questioning based on what you're saying about here. I think you're referring to what's happening in Jamaica, and you mentioned about racism. I've always grown up to hear that we've come from a classism culture. So we are there. You're confirming there is also racism as part of what we experience here as well.
Yes. So when we think of racism in the sense of colorism or shadeism, looking at the intersectionalities between race and class, then that's what we're referring to as racism. So we still know that predominantly Black people make up the majority of the working class in Jamaica, whereas light-skinned Jamaican tend to be at the top, and that is classified as racism. But sometimes because of our intermixing, it is seen more as shadeism rather than based on race, since where many Jamaicans might classify themselves as Black. So it's more of looking at those intersectionalities, shadeism or colorism, as being a part of that concept of racism. But you have more Jamaican scholars in recent years are taking on the notion of looking at racism rather than colorism to put that emphasis on the predominantly Black population that make up the working poor or the poor in Jamaica. So you'll see notions around racism rather than classism and colorism, or it being intertwined in more recent scholarship of Jamaicans. But that also comes from a lot of Jamaicans who, especially Kelly, and I know Carla Moore lives in Jamaica, but some of the scholarship too with Jamaicans who have studied internationally. Are there any more questions? Okay, if there are no more questions, then thank you very much for your time and your engagement in this conversation. I know my background is in sociolinguistic, but hopefully we would have learned something around the landscape. I know when I was reading for this presentation, even though I did an undergrad in history, I wasn't aware of the development in terms of media, especially the role of radical newspapers. So I appreciate the invitation from Tara to do this presentation because it also opened up my own knowledge. I was in Jamaica last year, York last year. Okay, all right. Have a wonderful day. I'll pass it over now to look for the pronunciation, Mariko. I was saying that I have a Japanese friend, my Japanese mother. Her name is Mariko, and being not the best at applied linguistics, I always mix up people's names. So thank you for that pronunciation.
Thank you so very much, Shawnee. It was an excellent presentation. I learned a whole lot, and I'm hoping that those who stayed on, they were able to garner as much and, be more exposed to what we deal with within our Jamaican setting and even the media.
Okay, thank you as well, Dr. Hardware. And thank you, Miss Tara, for inviting her. So we learned a new nickname for you, Miss. I know you guys are old friends, and we can really tell by the way how you address each other. So I'm pretty sure we learned a lot of information that we can use as DCS students, and I will definitely start paying more attention to Black representation or Black Jamaican representation in the media thanks to this presentation. And I'm pretty sure my classmates will do the same and everyone else who joined. Thank you to everyone who participated. I appreciate you. It was a fulfilling discussion mixed with a presentation. So thank you everyone, and may God watch between us as we part ways.
Okay, thank you so much. So we'll connect and take care.